Leslie Curry has commented on sampling and recruitment in her modules on interviews and FTGs, but let me add a few slides on the basic principles. The aim of the sampling strategy is to maximize the opportunity to produce enough data to answer the research question. So all the time it's the research question that we have in mind. Study participants should be selected systematically, not arbitrarily. And you have to establish clear criteria and rationale for the sample selection. And this should be made explicit when you make your proposal and document it very thoroughly in your research report. Many of you have a background in quantitative research, and it's very important to be aware that sampling in qualitative research is very different from sampling in quantitative research. The aim in quantitative research is to produce a sample that is representative in a statistical way of the whole population of interest. It's a probability sample in which each member of the population has an equal chance of being selected. In qualitative research, on the other hand, sampling is usually purposive or strategic. Participants must have first-hand experience with the research topic and be able to talk about it. So that is, people are deliberately selected as participants because they are likely to generate appropriate and useful data relevant to the research question. Let's look at purposive sampling. It's selection on the basis of personal characteristics. It could be gender, age, education, or socioeconomic status. Or it could be selection based on their experience with a particular event or a phenomenon. For example, they could have taken part in a demonstration, or they can have just given birth or something. It could also be based on their behavior, their sexual behavior, for example, or on their attitudes or beliefs, or any other criteria that would be of interest. So there are numerous purposive sampling procedures, but the most common ones are maximum variation, extreme or deviant case sampling, or typical case sampling. The maximum variation sampling is the most common one, and for example, you may want to include people with different educational background, with different participation in the work market, or with different socioeconomic status. And an example would be if I was doing a study looking at perceptions and experiences of mothers breastfeeding their children for the first 6 months exclusively, then I would maybe want the perspectives of different kinds of women. Some who are actively working or being employed, so that they are dependent on their employer for breastfeeding breaks, and women who are at home, and women with different educational backgrounds and different socioeconomic status, for example. So purposive sampling, or strategic sampling as we also call it, is the ideal sampling method in qualitative research, but it's not always possible to do a purposive sampling. And we also have sampling methods that are less stringent, convenience and snowball sampling. Conceptually, these are very distinct from purposive sampling. In a convenience sampling method, you rely on opportunity and chance. For example, it could be you want to recruit the first person that comes to the clinic for a particular service. For example, bringing its under 5 child for vaccination. You want to do a study on mothers' experiences related to, or perceptions related to, vaccination. So you recruit the first and the best. We also have snowball sampling. And then you rely on social network of the first person that you recruit. And this first person then will function as a seed. And you did an exercise based on the article Striving to Make a Difference, Health Worker Experiences with Intimate Partner Violence Clinics in Tanzania. And in that study, snowball sampling was used. And many of you criticized that for not being very rigid. And it is criticized for lacking credibility. But it may also be the only option when populations are vulnerable or hard to reach. So, who is your study population? Who do you want to be able to say something about? Do you expect any group within the population to vary with respect to the issues of interest in the research, so that you would want to use subpopulations? Which could differ then, as we mentioned before, on social demographic factors, on experiences, and so on. This is just an example of a sampling grid in studies that use subpopulations. So here you have adolescents in school and adolescents out of school. They may be married, not married, parent, not parent, and you want to cover all these different statuses. A sampling grid can be very complex. This is just a small, simple example. Another important issue is how many people you should include in your study, the issues related to sample size. And this is related to how many subpopulations you want to compare, you want to include in your sample. But it also is related to available time, resources in general, materials, resources, money. Each subgroup included will add to the complexity of the data and implies increased work and increased time and cost. And that also goes for the analysis part. What will be the minimum number of participants per subgroup, and what will be the maximum number of participants that you can include for each group and still have a manageable sample? Because you should be aware that analysis of qualitative data is incredibly time consuming, and you will experience that when you start analyzing your findings in the research exercise. Now, how do we decide on how many we should recruit in a qualitative study? This brings us to the principle of saturation that you've also heard about earlier in this course. The number of study participants cannot be calculated prior to the study, but they can be indicated. It is decided on in the process based on the data saturation, as we have talked about. We are including interviewees until the point of saturation where nothing new emerges from the data. And this is a flexible approach that is closely linked to the ongoing data analysis, which generates new ideas to pursue. So you go back and forth between data analysis and data collection, so that every time you've done an interview or you've done observations of a particular phenomena, you sit down, go through it, and decide whether you now have enough data to be sure that you have something valid to report, or whether you need more information to illuminate your research question. The saturation principle is not the only concern. It's also practical issues that come up when we decide on the sample size. We are likely to run out of time and money before our saturation has happened. Most sponsors want details on who and how many in the protocol before research is funded. So we need to say something about it. And if we are addressing a fairly specific research question in an interview study, it would be appropriate to indicate 15 or 20 interviews, but be aware that this may very well change as you do your recruitment is time-consuming and may be difficult for practical and ethical reasons. You may have to use gatekeepers, and gatekeepers can be local community leaders, or it can be managers or nurses or other health workers in hospitals, for example. But there are some risks of using gatekeepers because they are in power positions and they may recruit, for example, their own friends if assets are involved, and then they may bias the sample. And the study participants, on the other hand, may also feel obliged, thus compromising the principle of voluntary participation. In summary, participants must have first-hand experience with a research topic in order to be participants in a qualitative research study. I'll remind you that the goal is not generalizations of findings, but rich descriptions of phenomenon by those who have experience with it.